It was around 2020 that a mysterious new drug started to pop up everywhere. Delta 8. Everything from weed, edibles, vapes, tinctures, and more was showing up in every gas station and vape shop across the nation. At first, people had questions. How is this stuff legal if it gets you high? How is it made? And is it even safe to consume? But regardless of the skepticism, Delta 8 soon became a $2 billion industry, an industry that sold its intoxicating products to all 50 states, all legally. However, as the years went on, the dark side of Delta 8 was fully exposed. With multiple brands containing heavy metals like nickel, copper, and lead, lab-grown products lying about being natural, and much, much more, it became clear that Delta 8 was not what it seemed. So, where did it all start? Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the Farm Bill of 2018. At face value, this piece of federal legislation seems pretty innocent. Its main intent was to provide support and stability to US farmers by enhancing farm support programs, improving crop insurance, and maintaining disaster programs, among other things. However, the most notable part of the Farm Bill was the legalization of hemp farming and distribution. And I know what you're thinking. This looks exactly like the plant that makes weed. While that's true, there is a noticeable difference between the two. You see, the hemp plant and marijuana plant are both considered cannabis plants, but hemp contains less than 0.3% of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, marijuana's primary psychoactive chemical. On the other hand, marijuana contains greater than 0.3%. Also, legalizing it allowed US farmers to use hemp in the production of fiber, rope, food, and more. So removing it from being a Schedule I drug seemed like a no-brainer for Congress. However, this small amendment to the Farm Bill would eventually be responsible for creating one of the biggest unregulated drug industries the US has ever seen. It didn't take long for cannabis entrepreneurs to discover a huge money-making opportunity with the legalization of hemp. You see, the language of the hemp amendment made it clear that Congress was only worried about the levels of delta-9 being produced. They made no mention of any restrictions on any other cannabinoids that were in hemp, including Delta 8. Now, fair warning, I'm gonna talk a little bit of chemistry here, so if you failed it in college like I did, don't worry, I'll try to explain this as simple as possible. So hemp contains over 100 cannabinoids that all have different effects on the human body. Delta 9 is the most famous one because it's what gets you high. But there's also Delta 8, which is extremely similar to Delta 9. They have the same chemical formula, identical molecular weights, and similar psychological effects on the body. The only difference between the two is this tiny double bond in its chemical structure. Now, regulating or banning Delta 8 didn't make much sense to Congress because the hemp plant, and cannabis plants in general, naturally contain tiny amounts of Delta 8. But cannabis entrepreneurs were able to change that. Through a chemical process, they were able to synthetically transform all of the CBD in hemp, which is another legal cannabinoid, into Delta 8. And better for them, they could do so in huge quantities, enough to where it was commercially viable for them to make a profit. With this chemical process in hand and their sights set on making millions, these entrepreneurs began extracting massive amounts of completely legal psychoactive Delta 8 and began to create and sell joints, blunts, gummies, vaping devices, and more in all 50 states. By the time 2020 rolled around, people across the US started to find Delta 8 everywhere. It seemed like overnight that jars full of weed littered gas station counters, and edibles were proudly shown on vape shop shelves, even in prohibition states. This seemed insane to people, especially in those states where weed was illegal. But that didn't stop them from being curious. Throughout 2020, Google searches for Delta 8 skyrocketed by 850%. And with that, consumers gave the drug a try. While probably terrified that these mysterious ExxonMobil gas station drugs were going to kill them, a good majority of users found Delta 8 to be quite pleasant. They discovered that Delta 8 was sort of like a diet weed, giving them similar benefits to Delta 9 while not getting them incredibly baked. Delta 8 quickly became the fastest growing segment of hemp-derived products, with sales estimated to be around $200 million. Now, while that number was dwarfed by marijuana's roughly $20 billion in sales the same year, it was clear that Delta 8 was a force of nature, a force that the FDA was very concerned about. As Delta 8 became more popular throughout 2021 and 2022, the agency simply couldn't ignore it. A drug that had not been evaluated or approved by the FDA was getting into the hands of millions who could potentially be in severe danger from the drug's unknown effects. So the FDA began digging, and what they found was very concerning. They discovered that many of the brands selling Delta 8 made erroneous claims that their products could treat medical conditions like pain relief and cancer-related symptoms while also being a great dietary supplement. And they were doing so while ignoring the fact that all of these claims had to legally be approved by the FDA. But these insane marketing claims were just the start of the problems. From 2021 to 2022, over 100 people reported to the agency that the Delta 8 products they used were causing some serious side effects. Side effects that landed 55% of them in the hospital. Those adverse effects included hallucinations, vomiting, tremors, anxiety, dizziness, confusion, and loss of consciousness. Couple that with National Poison Control Centers reporting over 2,300 exposure cases related to Delta 8 products, where 41% involved children, 70% required hospital evaluations, and 1 death occurred, and it was clear that the FDA needed to act fast. In May of 2022, they issued 5 warning letters to some of the most popular Delta 8 companies on the market, forcing them to shut down operations within 15 days or face legal action. They were trying to make it clear to the public that they weren't going to fuck around when it came to regulating this new drug. But little did the FDA know that this new drug would be much worse than what they ever thought it would be. Throughout 2022, several more studies, surveys, and research were done to find the real truth about Delta 8. How was it made? What was even in this stuff? And is it safe to consume? Everyone wanted to find the answers, and the answers they found were shocking. To start, researchers wanted to investigate the claim that Delta 8 was purely natural. This was a huge selling point across multiple brands and was labeled on all sorts of products. But was it actually true? Well, remember that chemical process I mentioned earlier where entrepreneurs could transform CBD into Delta 8? When you break down what actually happens during that process, you can start to see how unnatural Delta 8 really is. Everything starts with the CBD in hemp, which can be anywhere between 1 to 20% concentration depending on the strain. That CBD is then dissolved in a solvent like hexane, and from there, it undergoes a process of adding acid and heat, eventually transforming into Delta 8. The 0.1% of Delta 8 naturally found in hemp turns into a 1 to 20% batch of purely synthetic garbo, roughly 10 to 200 times more, which is plenty enough to sell commercially. So yeah, this chemical process completely gets rid of any trace of any naturally derived Delta 8 in these products. But it also does something much worse. In another study, a mass spectrometer was used on 27 different Delta 8 products across 10 available brands. And what it found in those products might get your stomach turning. None of the products contain the advertised amount of Delta 8, with almost all of them containing up to 40% less than reported. Instead, in its place were heavy metals like magnesium, chromium, nickel, copper, zinc, mercury, lead, and silicone. Ingesting these metals in any form obviously leads to adverse side effects, which can start with symptoms like shortness of breath or chest pain, but can lead to worse problems like kidney dysfunction, nervous system disorders, skin lesions, immune system dysfunction, and birth defects. Also found in these products was hydrochloric acid, the acid used in the synthetic process, and a 13% concentration of more unstudied cannabinoids. So yeah, those Delta 8 gummies you see at your local shelf aren't really what they seem to be. With this information published to the public, you would think that consumers would maybe second guess their choice to smoke some Delta 8 reefer. But it didn't seem to stop anyone. As a matter of fact, the Delta 8 industry exploded through 2023. The US market for Delta 8 and other hemp-derived cannabinoids increased 1,283%, from $200 million in sales in 2020 to $2.8 billion in 2023. It was clear as day. The market for Delta 8 products was running full steam ahead, with little to nothing stopping it. The FDA was issuing more warnings to more companies, but that was only putting the tiniest of dents in the massive production and sale of the new drug. It seemed like the FDA couldn't do anything about this, and Delta 8 was teed up to be the next ginormous unregulated drug industry. But there's a tiny piece of information I've been keeping from you guys that could drastically affect the future of Delta 8 forever. You see, the Farm Bill of 2018 isn't a set-in-stone piece of legislation. For its entire existence since 1933, the Farm Bill legally has to get revoted every 5 years, with the exception of Congress having the ability to extend the previous Farm Bill for another year. This means that it can change at any time every half-decade, and allows for new rules and regulations to be put into place wherever need be. The 2018 Farm Bill was extended before it was set to expire in September of 2023, which means that in September of 2024, anything can change about it, including the laws around hemp. Now, is this a guarantee that Delta 8 products will vanish by the end of 2024? Probably not. But there's sure as hell going to be a push from the FDA and DEA to get the Farm Bill amended to restrict selling synthetically created drugs, or at least give them the power to do so. For now, Delta 8 is still a thriving industry, with its long-term effects unknown and very few restrictions in place on what's in it, how it's marketed, and how it's made.